I was once in a standoff. I was involved. It involved me. It involved my best friend, Pastor Dennis. It involved the car and alley. It involved the deep, dark streets of Wilmington. And it involved a tow truck. About 2 weeks before I was going to get married, Christine and I, we got into an argument. And it was a pretty big one. I don't even remember what it was about, but I just remember the end result of it was, I don't know if we should get married. And I don't know if it was me saying it to her or her saying it to me, but I just remember there was this argument, and we're kind of going at it, and she goes, I'm calling Dennis. Dennis was going to do our wedding, but Dennis was also my best friend. And so Dennis comes over to Christina's grandma's house where we're arguing, and he comes in, and she's like, he there, and I'm like, she there, and I'm like, I'm not sure, and she's like, I'm not sure either. And so we're arguing there, and it just kind of got to the point where I was like, you know what, I'm done with this. I don't want to get married. And so I storm out of grandma's house. He was like, I can't believe he's sharing this. So I storm out of grandma's house. I get into my car. Dennis comes running out of the house, and he stands in front of the car, and he's like, don't take off. And I remember looking at him saying to him, if you don't move, I'm going to run you over. And so there we are in a standoff. I'm in the driver's seat. Dennis is standing there in front of the car like, I'm not going anywhere. Go back inside the house and talk to her. And so we're looking. I'm here. He's on the other side of the glass right there. And I'm like, I'm serious. You better move. Keep in mind before you judge me, I was only 22, okay? So don't judge me. And so I'm sitting there. I'm like, move. He's like, I refuse to move. It was like some dramatic, corny guy movie. But we were standing there. And so I start inching the car closer to his body. And he looks at me like, oh, you're serious? I'm like, yeah, I'm serious. And so I press the car up against him. And he's like, I'm not moving. And so I start moving the car close. So he jumps on the hood of my car. So now he's like this on the hood of the car, holding on. And I'm like, get off. And he's like, I refuse to get off. He was like Titanic. I'll never let go. And so we're there, and he's holding on. And so I start, stepping and stopping, and now I'm shaking the car, trying to get him to come off. And I'm like, all right, you asked for it. This is about midnight, by the way, in Wilmington. And so I take off down the street. And so now we're going down Avalon, right there by Banning High School on PCH in that area. And Dennis is on the hood of my car. And all of a sudden, I'm like, you know what? I'm going to really get this guy off my car. So I drive down this little alley where gangs are known to hang out. I'm like, they'll get him off my car for me. And so I'm driving down the alley. I'm probably going maybe 35, 40 miles an hour with Dennis on the hood, and he's holding on. And finally, I go around the block, pull up in front of the house, and I'm like, I told you I was serious. So he gets off, and he's like, you know what? I'm done. Do whatever you guys want. I'm out of here. So he drives home. I get in my car to drive home. The only problem was we lived in the same house and we shared the same room and we were roommates, and so I was going to see him in just a moment. So he goes home. I get in the car to go home, and on the way home, I get a flat tire. And guess who I called? Because I didn't have AAA. Dennis. Okay, so he has to come. It was just the weirdest thing, but I remember that night we were in a standoff. And I was like, you better move. And he's like, I refuse to move. And you come in, and I refuse to go in. And it was one of those moments. And I think all of us in here, maybe not that dramatic, but we've all been in standoffs before, right? Where both sides are looking at the situation and saying, I'm right. No, I'm right. No, you give in. No, you give in. Some of us have been there in our marriages. We've had this standoff when it comes to our spouses. Some of us have been here before, even with our children. The first time your child ever tells you no. Anybody ever been there before? You're like, what do I do? Do I spank them? For me, it was like electrical cords and belts when I was little. I said no, but I remember being in the standoff even with my own kids, them telling me no. In our passage this morning, we have a standoff. And it's a standoff between two men who both love the Lord. It's a standoff between two men who, if you take a look at it, neither one was wrong. We have a standoff between two men, two apostles. There were two opinions, and most importantly, there were two different hearts within this standoff. On one side, would you guys notice with me there in chapter 15, verse 37, it says Paul or Barnabas was determined to take John Mark with them. So on one side, we have someone who was stubborn yet determined. We're taking him on the trip. And yet on the other side, look at verse 38 with me, we're told that Paul was insistent that John Mark was not going to come on the next mission trip. So we have a determined man on one side. We have an insistent man on the other side. And it begs the question this morning, when we're in these situations, when we see this type of scenario play out before us, who's right? Maybe you got into a fight with your spouse this morning. Let me ask you, who is right? Maybe you've been fighting with your employer, with somebody at work lately. Who's right? Maybe you and a friend, you guys haven't been seeing eye to eye lately, and the question's gone out, well, who's right? Well, let's make it a little bit more personal this morning. Relationships, they can be messy, can't they? And relationships, they can get kind of sticky. They get kind of tricky, don't they? Sometimes relationships can get kind of pokey and painful at times. Let me read to you guys a quote from a German philosopher who was talking about the human race compared to a bunch of porcupines. And he talks about them cuddling up together on a cold winter night. He said, the colder it gets outside, the more we huddle together for warmth. But the closer we get to one another, the more we hurt one another with our sharp quills. And in the lonely night of Earth's winter, eventually we begin to drift apart and wander out on our own and freeze to death in our loneliness. Christ has given us an alternative to bear with one another, to forgive each other for the pokes we receive. That allows us to stay together and stay warm. Colossians chapter 3, verse 13 says, bearing with one another and forgiving one another. If anyone has a complaint against another, even as Christ forgave you, so you also must do. In relationships, people poke. And sometimes in relationships, there's already scabs, aren't there? There's scars. And it seems like, especially within marriage, it's like your spouse, unintentionally, I hope, just knows how to pick at the scab. It seems like in marriage sometimes your spouse unintentionally just knows how to go after that ex-wound. It seems like sometimes the enemy loves to bring up things from the past. And all of a sudden, these things, they begin to poke. And they become painful. And they hurt. And sometimes they're offensive. And sometimes they cause us to not want to be around one another or communicate with each other. And all of a sudden, the relationship begins to drift apart. And all of a sudden, the Lord comes in and he says, bearing with one another and forgiving one another. If anyone has a complaint against another, even as Christ forgave you, why don't you turn around and forgive them? And more importantly, even as Christ forgave you, you must forgive them. You know why? Because Jesus has already forgiven them. And so the same thing that it seems like we kind of keep on poking each other with, it's already been forgiven and forgotten in his mind. And yet we want to keep bringing the thing up, don't we? He's already dealt with it and moved on from it. We're told that he takes it and drops it into the deepest of seas. We're told that if it's sin, he takes it and removes it as far as the east is from the west. We're told that when he drops it in the deepest of seas, that he remembers it no more. And yet in relationships, we hold on. We keep going with it. And all of a sudden, you might find yourself this morning in the midst of a relationship that is at a standoff. And unfortunately, the standoff in our passage this morning does not result in a resolution right away. And the reason there is no resolution immediately is because both men, at least at first glance, were right. They were right. Let's deal with the marriage thing real quick, and then we'll get into the passage. One of the things I learned early on in marriage that somebody told me someone has to die. You know, you and Christina, you guys can both feel that you're right. You and Christina can both look at each other and state your case, and each case might be strong. He said, but until someone dies, even if both sides are right, you guys are going to continue to go at it. He says, eventually someone has to say sorry. Eventually someone has to die to their flesh and say, you know what? Can we just work this out? Eventually someone has to say, you know what? I'm sorry that it hurt you. Inside you might be saying, I'm right, but I'm sorry that me being right hurt you. Eventually, someone has to die. And for some of us, our marriages are falling apart. For some of us, they're extremely strained. For some of us, it's to the point where you're here, they're there, and there's no longer communication between the two. I want to encourage you guys this morning, before we enter our passage, die. You don't usually hear your pastor tell you that, dude. I just want you guys to die. Somebody, please, for the sake of your home. How about this one? For the sake of your children, would one of you die? For the sake of the church body. And sometimes you can tell when people walk in and it's like, ooh. And it's like, ooh, do I take their side? Or like, I don't even want to talk to them, you know? So, Samuel, start the music, hurry, so we can get in and sit in the seats, because we don't even want to, we could just see it. And so sometimes, even for the sake of the church body, would someone die? In our text, no one was willing to die, at least right away. Before we get into the passage in verse 36, I want to just take a moment, because some of you guys might not be familiar with the story, so I think it's important for us to cover what exactly causes this standoff between Paul and Barnabas. The person that causes the standoff is a guy by the name of John Mark, or some of you guys might know him as the author of the Gospel of Mark. Mark was a son of a wealthy woman named Mary, who had a good or great influence on the church at this particular moment. In fact, it was in Mary's house that the church was praying for Peter. You guys remember back in Acts chapter 12, we're told that they were in the house, they were praying for Peter as he was in prison, and all of a sudden Peter shows up to the door, and you guys know my favorite girl in the Bible, a girl by the name of Rhoda comes up, and that whole scene. And so that was Mark, that was Mary, that was their home. One of the things we're told later on in Scripture was that Mark had a special relationship with the Apostle Paul. In 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 13, Peter refers to Mark as his son. Not son in the faith, but his literal son. Was Peter married to Mary? We're not sure. But what we do know is that this guy Mark, he had that type of relationship with Peter. Mark was the one who wrote the Gospel of Mark. It was the first of the 4 different Gospels that were delivered to us. And the importance here concerning Mark and his ministry was, since he was the first Gospel to be written, Mark was the first one to give us the life and ministry of Jesus. Mark was used, we see primarily, whether it was Paul and Barnabas on the first missionary trip, or whether it was alongside Peter and Peter's ministry, we see that Mark was used as an assistant. Most likely, the Gospel of Mark was written, or could be accurately described as the Gospel of Peter, because most of the material that's found in there came from Peter himself. Mark was more like a secretary, a note-taker for Peter when it came to the Gospel of Mark. One of the things that I think is important for us to understand as we get into the story this morning concerning Mark was the cousin of Barnabas, according to Colossians chapter 4, verse 10. And so we got some personal stuff going on here. So we got Paul, we got Barnabas. Barnabas says we take him. Paul says we don't take him. And so obviously for Barnabas, there was the family, there was the personal aspect to this whole standoff that was taking place. You guys remember back in Acts chapter 13, in the city of Perga, we're told that Mark, in the midst of the first missionary journey, the first trip that this group took, it says that he decided to leave the team and return to Jerusalem. So let me recap everything that's going on. There's a whole bunch of drama because of a guy named Mark. Earlier in the book of Acts, there was a missionary trip. Paul, Barnabas, they took John Mark with them on the trip. Halfway through the trip, John Mark is there. And he essentially says, I'm packing my bags and I'm going back home. And so now they're about to take a second trip. Now Paul gets the idea, let's go back to those places and let's visit them again. In fact, look at verse 36 with me this morning. It says, then after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, let us now go back and visit our brethren in every city where we have preached the word of the Lord and see how they are doing. It says after some days. We're talking about, most people say about an 18-month period of time here between when John Mark abandoned them on the first trip and all of a sudden they bring him now or want to bring him on the second trip. And so Paul gets the idea. He says, let's go back to every city and let's visit those churches that we planted. He says, in fact, let's go back and let's see, look at verse 36 with me, see how they are doing. Let's go check up on them. You see, Paul obviously had the heart not only of a missionary, but we're going to notice later on, Paul had the heart of a shepherd, of a pastor. And so Paul was one of the guys that was like, you know what, I'm not going to just go into a city, lead someone to the Lord, and then all of a sudden forget how they're doing. I'm not the kind of guy that's going to go into a city, lead someone to Christ, and then all of a sudden abandon them and never check up on them. He was the kind of guy that says, I want to go back and I want to see how they're doing. I want to see if they're still walking. I want to see what's coming out of their mouth. Is it glorifying to God or is it revolved around the flesh? I want to go back and see how they're doing. Well, let me stop right here for a minute. Have you ever led someone to the Lord? Have you ever been there, spent time with someone, poured into someone, they came to know the Lord, and then for whatever reason, circumstances, situations, distance has caused you to no longer be around that person? Well, let me ask you, do you ever think about them? Do you ever sit there and wonder what happened? Do you ever sit there and think, well, what was the outcome of their faith? And do you ever get to the point where at the end of verse 36, you want to see how they're doing? I remember over the summer, I went to summer camp with the youth ministry at South Bay. And I came back. And I don't know why, but my heart came back very curious about some of my old students. You guys know I did youth ministry for 10 years at South Bay. And every Sunday, we had anywhere from maybe 300 to 400 students come through the door. And so you take that, times it for 10 years. I mean, we're talking about, there was a lot of students that passed through my life during that time. And so I came back and I was like, I couldn't stop thinking about all these old high schoolers who are now in their 20s. I couldn't shake the thought of, how are they doing? I wonder what's going on. I wonder how many of them are still walking with the Lord. And thanks to Facebook, they didn't have this back then, but thanks to Facebook, you can obviously see how some of them are doing presently. And sometimes even when you go on Facebook, it gets kind of depressing, right? Because you're like, man, or you see them post something, you're like, I taught a Bible study on that, and what are you doing? And you want to reach through the screen and say something, or you see pictures that they post, and you're like, oh, God, you're like my own dog, what are you doing? And you're sitting there and you're like, it breaks your heart. And that's what was going on with Paul. He's like, I just want to see how they're doing. I want to see if they're still walking. And if they're not walking, I'd love to have a moment with them to encourage them, to strengthen them, to point them back to the Lord. And so obviously this whole thing began with a good heart. Notice verse 37 with me. So as we continue in verse 37, it says, now Barnabas was determined to take with them John, called Mark. But Paul insisted that they should not take with them the one who had departed from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. And so we see each one and their stance. And at first view, obviously both of them have a case. Verse 37, Barnabas is like, you know what? We're going back. Let's take John Mark with us. It's been 18 months now. No doubt, probably John Mark was back serving in ministry. He was probably in his little assistant roles there around the church in Jerusalem. People were no doubt probably coming to his home still for home fellowships and prayer meetings. He'd been around the church. He'd been around people. Barnabas is like, he's doing good. Let's take him with us. But in verse 38, Paul's like, no. We're not taking him with us. In fact, look at the wording that he uses. It says, Paul insisted that they should not take him. Or how about this one? They should not take, oh, this is strong right here, the one who had departed them. And notice the end of verse 38. The one who had not gone with them to the work. So Paul's like, oh, heck no, we're not taking this guy. We were in the midst of battle. We're in the midst of God's work. And right in the middle of it, the moment it starts to get hard, he packed his bags. And Paul is looking and saying, I don't care if he's doing good now. It doesn't matter to me if it seems like he's stronger than he was 18 months ago. We are not taking him on this trip. Last time I was counting on him, we were depending on him, and he let us down. Let me say a word right here to all of us. I think it's important that we realize that every single one of us in here matters. Every single one of us in here counts. I sound like I'm about to give one of those positive motivational speeches, right? You count. Just as long as you send me $99.99, I will tell you how one. No, I'm not going to give that. But in the church, every single one of us, if you are committed to do something, if you say you're going to teach the children's ministry, if you say, hey, I'm dedicated to be a part of the worship team, if you say that, hey, this is my church, how can I help? You're an important part of the team. In fact, you're counted on as part of the team. What do I mean by that? When one part isn't holding up their corner, everything falls apart, doesn't it? You guys remember back in Mark chapter 5, there was a guy, we're told a lame man. And you guys remember the friends, the 4 friends? They wanted to get their friend to Jesus. So they got to the house where Jesus was. They couldn't get through the door, so they went, took him up on the roof, uncovered the tile, laid him through the roof, down to where Jesus was. But what's always stood out to me about that story was the Bible tells us there were 4 of them. And it says that they grabbed his cot. So no doubt as they grabbed this cot, a cot has how many corners? 4. And so in this man's life, every one of his friends, each one grabbed a corner. So you had one in that corner, one in this corner, one in that corner, one in this corner. 4 corners, 4 friends. Now imagine if one of the friends decided, you know what, this guy's kind of heavy. Did you go to the taco truck last night? No. It's like, imagine if in the moment it's like, I don't know if I want to carry this. Or they get to the house and it's like, wait, I thought we were just going to go through the door. The roof? I'm not sure about this. And all of a sudden they drop their corner.
They say they're out of here. Wait, but this is a 4-man job. And you're about to leave your post. And it's the same thing within the church. If you have your corner, we're counting on you to hold up your corner. If you have a post, we're counting on you. We're depending on you to keep your post. And so for this guy, John Mark, he had his post, his corner on the missionary team. And for whatever reason, he left this post. And so Paul is looking and he's saying, I can't have that happen again. This mission trip is already hard enough. In fact, the first one almost cost Paul his life. You guys remember, he was stoned. He was beaten. They were persecuted. He's like, it's crazy out there. I can't have someone leaving their post. Let's go back to the original question this morning. Who is right? You know, I've kind of stated both sides, kind of shared a little bit about both arguments, gave you at least the broad picture of what was happening here. Who is right? Well, if I were to go on this side, you know, Christina might say, I think Barnabas was right, you know, because that was his cousin, you know, and where we're from, we're all about familia. You know, it's like, you know what, she's like, you know what, that's where I stand. And, you know, I might go on this side and Dan's like, no, that's not true. Paul was right. You know, because I'm used to big jobs and big stuff, and I'm used to relying on, you know, and we could lay out the argument on both sides and say, well, he was right, he was right. Well, would you guys write this down? Barnabas was more concerned about the man. This is one thing we do know. Barnabas was more concerned about the man. Would you write this one down? Paul was more concerned about the ministry. Is either one wrong? No. Is it wrong to be concerned about the individual? No. Is it wrong to be concerned about the masses? No. And so at first glance, both of them are displaying a shepherd's heart. Well, let me just say this real quick. There was somebody wrong, John Mark. You don't leave your team. Anyways, that's another story for another Bible study. Let me say this, though. There was no scriptural evidence on either side to support either side's case. And so if this was you and I are looking for a winner, who was the right winner? There is no clear winner here. I like how a commentator put it. There is no passage in Scripture that says when a young missionary has forsaken the work on his first journey, you shall give him a second chance after 18 months of faithful service. Yet there is no biblical text that says not to either. This morning, if you guys are taking notes, I want to give you guys 2 simple points to write down. There's 2 simple things that I want you guys to make note of this morning in an effort to answer and to establish who's right. Let me give them to you both ahead of time. Number 1, if you're taking notes this morning, would you write this down? Barnabas was right. Number 1, Barnabas was right. Number 2, would you guys write this one down? Paul was right. I know you guys were thinking wrong, but Paul was right. You see, each of these men were very different. They had very different hearts, very different giftings. Some of you guys know our pastor has gone home to be with the Lord, Pastor Steve. And yet one of the things that I really learned from him, you know, I was seeing somebody, it was weird. On Facebook, the last 3 weeks, you can find all sorts of stuff about Pastor Steve. And everyone's sharing their stories. One guy even wrote an article on his blog about the 10 things that I learned or the 10 greatest Pastor Steve quotes or whatever it was. But there was one thing that I remember most about Pastor Steve. It was this. I remember him sitting down, and I remember him telling me when I first took over the high school ministry, he says, you want to hire your weakness. He sat me down and he said, you want to hire your weakness. He said, you want to surround yourself with those who make up your weakness. So he says, if you're going to be successful in this thing called ministry, And I remember him sitting down with me, he said, if you're going to be successful as a pastor, you have to learn to surround yourself with people who make up your weakness. He's like, you don't want a bunch of yous. You, whoever you are, whatever your DNA is, whoever God has gifted you and created you to be, you don't want to surround yourself with a bunch of you. He says you want to surround yourself with people who are not like you. People who make up your weakness. And I was like, well, why? He says, because you want the team, you want the group, you want the leadership to be complete. He says, you don't want to build up simply one part of the body. He said, when you go to the gym, you don't want to just build and work on only one muscle. And we've seen guys like that, right, at the gym. They're so huge up here, and then they got little turkey legs, you know? And I mean, they're sitting there, and they spend hours, and they walk around like this, and you're looking at their legs like, how do those things support the rest of that up there? You know, and they're just kind of walking. He's like, you want to be well-rounded. You want the whole thing to be strong. And so you surround yourself with your weakness. And I'll tell you, diverse people make up the body of Christ. You guys remember in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, the Bible tells us that there are diversity within the body of Christ. Some, he says, you're an eye. To the other one, he says, you're a finger. To the other, he says, you're a toe. Some of us are even an armpit. I mean, we'll leave it at that. But he says, no matter who you are, you're a part of the body. And we can't complain who God has made us to be. And let me say this, give me your eyes for a minute, church. Who are we to complain who God has made someone else to be? And so looking at Barnabas was obviously not Paul. In fact, Paul had leadership skills that Barnabas did not possess. How do we know that? Because when it first started, Barnabas went after Paul. You guys remember? When all the other apostles wanted to distance themselves from Paul, Barnabas was the only one willing to go and encourage Paul. And so the ministry began as Barnabas and Paul. You guys will notice earlier in the book of Acts. But you guys will notice that the more Paul grew in his relationship with the Lord, it quickly became Paul and Barnabas. There was a leadership about him. And then later on, in chapter 13 of the book of Acts, it got to the point where it was simply Paul and the team. And so Paul's leadership skills were so strong that eventually Paul, in a sense, became the face of the team. And so Barnabas was right, but he obviously wasn't Paul. But what I will say is this, and I think this is important. If you haven't been listening this whole message, would you at least listen now? Every John Mark, when he's failed, when he falters, when he's been found guilty, needs a Barnabas. You see, the person that has fallen, the person that has failed, the person that's messed up, the person that needs a second chance, Barnabas was the kind of guy, and we're told because he knew the grace of God, he was the kind of guy to come in and give someone like John Mark a second chance. You see, Barnabas was someone that reflected the heart of God. How do I know? The book of Jonah. Because God was into giving people second chances, wasn't he? Even when Jonah, we're told, blew it the first time and tried to flee the presence of the Lord, we're told in Jonah chapter 3 that the Lord came to Jonah a second time. He gave him a second chance to do what God had called him to do. And that's what Barnabas is trying to do here. He's trying to come alongside a guy who has failed and give him a second chance. A guy that's on the ground. Barnabas, being a guy of encouragement, comes and says, let me pick you up. Let me restore you. Let me help reconcile you to the team. That's the kind of guy that Barnabas was. And so obviously, a guy like this will always be right. You see, you go with the heart of God, you can't go wrong. you go on the side of grace, you can't be wrong. You be the kind of person that's extremely gracious and full of second chances, you can't be wrong. And so was Barnabas right? Barnabas was right. And I think sometimes we play the cousin thing a little too much. I don't even think it had anything. I think even if that wasn't his cousin, he would have simply saw a guy. That's how Barnabas was. And says, he deserves a second chance. Can we bring him on the trip? But number 2 this morning, Paul was right. Wait, if Barnabas was right, and the heart of God is second chances, then how's Paul right? Because he didn't want to give a second chance. Well, you see, Paul was right. Because the Bible tells us in the book of 1 Corinthians that we are to be a good steward over what God has entrusted to us. And so Paul looked at himself as a steward. You guys know what a steward is? A steward is someone who takes care of someone else's property. And so God looked at Paul and he said, I'm making you a steward over my people. I'm making you a steward over my ministry. I'm entrusting you with it. And obviously, when you're entrusted with something, you're very careful with it, aren't you? You want to keep things at a distance if it's any harm to something that does not belong to you. Every once in a while, I drive the MedReach Supervisor Mobile. It's just a big SUV with red and blue on it. But every once in a while, it has lights on top, but I don't ever get to use them. But every once in a while, I get to drive the MedReach Supermobile. And I'll tell you guys, when I drive this thing, I don't drive it the same way that I drive my own car. I mean, the other day, Kathy came by my car, and she looked in, and I had old taco wrappers from the day before, and my car is just kind of crazy, and I take out the trash only once a week, but so it kind of piles up in my car, and so that's how I treat my car. But oh my goodness, when I'm in the MedReach Supermobile, I'm paranoid. I'm in my car, I'm like this. In this thing, I'm like this. I'm all stuffy and stuck, I'm just like, I'm driving, and I'm paranoid. I'm braking every 5 seconds because someone's about to run in front of me, and I'm about to, I'm very paranoid because it's not mine. And so I'm a whole lot more careful with it. I'm a steward of it. And Paul looks and he says, the missionary team, he says, the people, the ministry, the calling, I got to be a good steward with what God has called me to. And he said the first time, this guy abandoned the team. And so this is how Paul has to think. Big picture. Remember, Barnabas is concerned with the individual. Paul has to think of the masses. He has to think, what if I let this guy back on and he does it again? He thinks, last time, I don't think John Mark will ever understand the hole that he created on that missionary trip. You see, Barnabas is just like, let's just bring him. And Paul's like, but Barnabas, that trip was harder. And there were definitely dominoes and consequences to John Mark's decision. And so Paul is looking at it for the sake of the team, for the sake of the ministry. I don't think I can trust them again, at least right now. Keep reading with me. So we're told there that they go, and we're going to finish there this morning. Verse 39. It says, then the contention became so sharp that they parted from one another. You know what's interesting? Chapter 15 has been about sharp contentions, haven't they? Go back to verse 2, the beginning of chapter 15. Remember Paul and Barnabas had a sharp contention with the Judaizers last week over circumcision? And then this week, verse 39, there's another sharp contention over John Mark. Let me explain to you guys the difference. You guys can close your Bibles. We're done this morning. Let me explain to you guys the difference. And I think this is really important for some of us because there's a whole lot of things out there that can divide us as a church. And there's a whole lot of disagreements that we can get into as God's people. But I think this is a good rule for some of us. The disagreement at the beginning of chapter 15. Paul and Barnabas standing off against the Judaizers over salvation through circumcision is a doctrinal issue. You see, salvation is at stake. Someone's eternal faith is at stake here. And so these guys are like, you know what? We're going to fight over this. And we're going to battle over this. And you guys remember the whole thing became so big that the council in Jerusalem comes in and this whole thing is blown up. But it's worthy of being blown up because it's a doctrinal issue. This isn't what we're going to see with Paul and Barnabas. We'll just agree to disagree and go our own way. We're talking about salvation of an entire people group, the Gentiles. And so, sharp disagreement beginning in chapter 15 over a doctrinal issue. Yes, we're going to fight over this. But later on, chapter 15, in our story this morning, there's a sharp dispute over whether a guy is called to be a part of a missionary team. It's a non-doctrinal issue. What does that mean? There's no salvation at stake here. Paul's saved, Barnabas is saved. John Mark is saved. Paul's going to serve the Lord, Barnabas is going to serve the Lord, John Mark's going to serve the Lord somewhere. There's no salvation at stake here. And I think sometimes we can get into big arguments as a church. How about this one? Is smoking wrong? I mean, people have been fighting about this one forever, right? All I know is if you smoke, you're going to go see Jesus quicker. So, I mean, whatever, you know what I mean? So if you want to smoke, you get to heaven faster. So we'll leave it at that one. But is someone's salvation at stake? If somebody has a cigar or somebody smokes a cigarette? No. So, okay, so let's just agree to disagree. Let's stop fighting about it. We have the whole alcohol one. A glass of wine or no glass of wine? Oh, Jesus turned water into wine. Okay, so who are going to argue? But then you got this one over here. Why am I going to put a stumbling block in front of someone? Could it stumble someone? If someone has a glass of wine, are they saved? Are they not? Or do they lose it? No, there's no salvation issue here. So what are we going to do? Agree to what? Disagree. It's not a doctrinal issue. The rapture. When's Jesus going to come back? A lot of churches argue over this one. Is it pre-trib, post-trib, mid-trib? You guys know what that means? Is it prior to the tribulation? Is it going to be halfway, 3.5 years into the tribulation? Or are you and I going to be a part of the tribulation and then the rapture is going to take place post-tribulation? Is our salvation at stake here? No. So we'll agree to disagree. Non-doctrinal issue. Should we have a stance? Yeah, we should probably have a stance. But are we going to let it divide us? No, we're not. And so I think it's important for all of us, and we're going to pray this morning, that we figure out, especially if you're in the midst of some sort of heated contention, some heated disagreement with someone, is it doctrinal or is it non-doctrinal? And I'll say this, if it's doctrinal, if salvation is at stake, or if it points to good works over grace and faith in Jesus Christ, you go fight. You argue. You battle. You contend for the faith. But if it's non-essential, then just let it go. And that's what these two did. They just simply said, you know what? We'll agree to disagree. Barnabas says, I'm going to take John Mark and we're going to go and do some ministry. Well, Paul says, well, you go that way, I'm going to go this way. I'm going to get Silas. You guys hear Silas later on. We're going to go that way. And the both go, and they move on to future ministry. Well, let's wrap it up and put a little bow on it. I mentioned that there was a resolution, just not right away. Well, later on in Colossians chapter 4, verse 10, Paul says, hey, John Mark, That's a good guy. Wait, what are you talking about? Barnabas says, he's a good guy. He says, he's here with me serving the Lord. And he says, hi, Church of Colossae. And then later on, in 2 Timothy, at the end of the book, close to Paul's death, Paul says, hey, can you go get Mark? I'm about to die. Can you go get Mark? I just want to see him. He's a good guy for ministry. And so we don't know what happened. We don't know how things changed or where the tables turned. We just know that at some point, reconciliation happened in this relationship. And it's a good thing. Father, we thank